Magovanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and if you're with me so far, I'm at Silmarillion Synopsis episode 10. That's the last one I published before this video. So basically, I've been thinking about the Silmarillion a lot for obvious reasons, and one of the things that I keep repeating in my Silmarillion Synopsis thread is, why is the Silmarillion so hard to get into for so many people? A lot of people love The Hobbit and have a bit of a hard time with Lord of the Rings because it's more adult. But a lot of people who love the Lord of the Rings have a really hard time getting into the Silmarillion, even though there's, in terms of the level of reading comprehension, it's really not that different. So what I want to do in this video is kind of explore, kind of as a retroactive explanation for why I'm doing my Silmarillion Synopsis series, why the Silmarillion is so hard to get into, and maybe talk about ways that we can think of to approach it differently to help people who maybe want to try again but are afraid to because of the hard time they had the first time. So let's first start with, why is the Silmarillion hard to read in the first place? One of the first differences that you'll notice when reading the Silmarillion as opposed to the Lord of the Rings, and especially The Hobbit, is the style of writing is very different. At times, The Lord of the Rings does get into a very high prose style, a very archaic style, but the Silmarillion pretty much maintains an archaic, high-style writing throughout the entire book. And so that's part of the reason that a lot of people have a hard time getting into it, is just, it's not like reading much of anything else. It's kind of like if all you're used to is modern vernacular English, and you suddenly start reading a Shakespeare play, you're not going to have the easiest time figuring out what's going on. The word order can be different than normal. And this is a thing that is really almost unique in English as opposed to other world languages. In English, word order makes a difference. Most languages, well, at least a lot of languages in the European gamut, I should say, most of them are Latin derived, and therefore the case-based system of how they work tells you the purpose of a word based on how it's written or how it sounds rather than where it is in the sentence. Whereas in modern English, almost everything we know about what the purpose of a word is, why it's in the sentence, and what it's doing is based on its word order. Older English, though, was a little bit different, and you can see this a lot in poetry especially. In poetry, more often than not, you'll find people switching word order around to create the rhymes, and you can figure out what it means by context, but typically that violates what we think of as a normal word order, and that's part of what Tolkien is doing. But also in older variations of the English language, back when there were more conjugations and case-based derivatives of words, you had more ability and flexibility with where to put words in a sentence and still do things like that. And so Tolkien is almost using a poetic style of writing throughout the Silmarillion. The word order he puts, not necessarily in the traditional way all the time. He's also using words that are more old-fashioned, of course, and that is largely intentional on his part, but it's mostly designed to give you this idea of a very old, very not archaic per se, but the idea of distance. You're so far removed from it that it's a really big deal. And there's, for people who grew up, for example, reading the King James Bible, they'll probably have a slightly easier time reading it because it's a little bit similar in that way. The King James was written back in 1611, and so for a lot of reasons similar to what Tolkien is doing, that style of writing was more natural to them, and Tolkien is kind of deliberately pushing us to be reading something that sounds much older, kind of like a King James, and an old traditional King James version, not the new King James version. So that's one aspect of that, and I'm going to come back to that connection with reading King James Version a bit later, because that plays into really more than one aspect of this topic. So keep that in mind for later. But for now, the point I'm trying to get across is the style is very much in that mode of we're trying to make you think of things that are old. And that is very much true because Tolkien is writing about things that purportedly are ancient history of our own world, basically. So that thing that he's shooting for is to create the idea that, yes, I'm reading about something that is true, but is very distant. And most modern readers are not used to that kind of writing style, and so that makes it difficult. So there's the writing style, but there's other things too, and let's talk about those. Another thing that tends to get a lot of people who can kind of start getting into it early on, but then they run into chapters where they suddenly hit the brakes. Those are the chapters usually that end up telling you about names. There's, you get to the chapter, the Vala Quinta, and you learn about all the Valar all at once, and you're getting all these names thrown at you, and some of them have multiple names. And then you get to the chapter of the princes of the Eldalia, and you get all these names thrown at you of the princes of the Noldorin elves, their families and all that sort of thing. You get these passages where you're mostly just learning about information which will later become important, but at the time you're just kind of sitting there going, why do I need to know all this? And so it's not really told in a traditional narrative style. Normally you end up with, for example, in the Lord of the Rings itself, you'll get references to, people, but they usually come up in the context of why they're important at the time. You meet characters, you don't learn about the character beforehand. I mean, you do occasionally, Boromir tells us about his father Denethor in the Council of Elrond, and then later we meet Denethor in person. But he doesn't talk about Faramir, because Faramir's not really that important, and he doesn't really talk about his father so much, even mainly for the reason that the only significant impact he has on the story is, he sends them off to tell, he tells them, well, Imladris means Rivendell, go find Rivendell. So you've got these kinds of things going on. You run into Strider, and then you learn his name is Aragorn, and that comes up in a scenario where his name becomes significant. You don't get all the names of Aragorn thrown at you all at once. He's Elessar, he's the Elfstone, he's Aragorn, he's Strider. You don't get all of that at one time. They come up as they're significant. In the Silmarillion, it's very different. You get, this name of Varda, who is the Vala associated with light and the stars, and she's called, all these different names. She's called Elbereth by the elves in Middle Earth. She's called other names too because of what she does, and all these different things like that. Manwë is surnamed Sulimo. You get tons of names thrown at you, and then you get other passages like that with elves. You get more passages like that as time goes. And so you get basically what are expositional chapters. They're just kind of setting up things that you'll need to know later, but they're just setting them up now. I mean, like when we get to the Princes of the Eldalia, we learn, Finwë, the king of the Noldor, had 3 sons, 2 of them through a second wife because his first wife died, and then you learn about their sons. You don't learn anything about how they really relate to each other, what their significance is, but almost all of them do become important much later in the story. Feanor is, of course, supremely important. Fingolfin and Finarfin are very important. Finarfin less so in the later stories, but his children become very important. Finrod becomes very important later on. Orodreth becomes important later on. His other 2 sons, not quite as much. Fingolfin's sons, Fingon and Turgon, they become important later on. So, I mean, you're learning about these people who will become important, and you have to know them. But the way that it's done in the Silmarillion, they cram it all up front, and you learn about all these names without really learning their significance yet, and it becomes a little bit overwhelming. And then you do have some chapters that aren't even necessarily throwing tons of names, but they are giving you kind of just exposition without giving you a lot of narrative. And in that way, the Silmarillion is also just a very different style of work, because it's not like the Lord of the Rings, a traditional narrative where you're just kind of going chronologically. Sometimes you just get exposition that kind of sets up things that are coming up later. And this again, making that connection with the King James Bible, or any version of the Bible really, you'll get passages like that in the Bible as well. And that becomes significant for the last thing that I want to talk about, which is the idea of genre. And I'll talk about that last because I think it's probably the most significant. But the main thing here is you get all these names. And of course, the names aren't even remotely connected to anything that most English speakers would be familiar with. They are, in some sense, loosely based on human languages because Tolkien based some of his languages on, various human languages, Finnish, Welsh, different things like that. So, I mean, there's some connection, but none of these names are going to leap off the page and go, oh, I know what that means. They're made up. And so not only are you getting tons of them, you're having all this stuff thrown at you that you can't easily stick in your brain, because the first time you read Fingolfin as a name, you're like, okay, what's that? Whereas if you just threw out a traditional English name and be like, okay, well, I know what that is. You already have a space in your brain dedicated to that knows that name. Whereas in the Silmarillion, you can never rely on that. And so you just get this dump of information that you don't have a way to process easily. So that's another aspect. Now let's go ahead and talk about genre. Both of the aspects that I've already talked about, the high style, the archaic language, and the way in which he treats exposition not in a traditional narrative frame, both play into this idea of genre. And that's why I wanted to touch on it last, because it kind of pulls all of this together and explains what is going on in the Silmarillion. One of the things that you'll notice in the Silmarillion is it all does go together as one continuous story, but it's not really just one continuous narrative. It all does fit together, but it's not like the Lord of the Rings where you're following one set of characters through their arc to the end. That's not how the Silmarillion works. The first chunk of the Silmarillion basically deals with the creation of Tolkien's world through basically the return of the Noldor from Valinor back to Middle-earth and their war with Melkor Morgoth. And then you get these really much longer chapters dealing with particular individuals and their adventures. And then those particular chapters read more like a traditional narrative. And then we kind of go back off. This is kind of spoiling it for anybody who doesn't know, but it goes back off into something more like the earlier chapters where you get just events going on and you're not quite following a normal narrative structure, although you are more so, because you do get, even in the later chapters, you're following certain individuals through and it kind of ties some threads together, but it's still not like the three main stories, which are the Beren and Luthien story, the Turin Turambar story, and the Fall of Gondolin story. Those are, those three chapters are really kind of the big traditional narrative type stories in the Silmarillion, but everything else around them and at times in between them is just kind of filling in the gaps and explaining how we got here and where we're going afterwards. So you've got a lot of different things going on. And in that sense, again, this is where I tie it back to, comparison to the Bible. The Bible is very similar. You've got Genesis and Exodus, which are historical books. Exodus kind of follows the story of one man, Moses, in a sense. But Genesis is just kind of a general history book, more or less, and follows a lot of different people over a long span of time. And then you get other types of books, and you get, just some of them are not even narrative at all. The Psalms is not a narrative book in any way, shape, or form. It's a bunch of songs. That's all it is, which you don't get that in the Silmarillion, although you do get references to, oh, there's a song about this, by the way, which tells the story in more detail, and Tolkien actually worked on some of those. He tried to make long poems of the Beren and Luthien and Turin Turambar stories, and one or two others, I don't remember offhand which. But by and large, it's the same kind of idea. You get a collection of works in the Silmarillion, more or less. It's not quite the same as the Bible, because the Silmarillion, they are all narrative in some sense, except, the expositional chapters where you just get names of the Valar. You don't really get that. But even that is similar to what you get in some of the books of the Bible, where you just get long genealogies. And those are similar in terms of reading, but they're not really similar in terms of purpose, so I don't want to overemphasize that point. In the Bible, of course, the genealogies are important because they play a huge role in Judaism, because who you are as a Jew depends upon your lineage. And of course, it also makes a huge difference if you're a Christian, because the genealogies play into who Jesus is and that sort of thing. And I'm sure this was all at least somewhat in Tolkien's mind in writing this, not as an influence per se, but I'm sure he was at least aware of the idea that lineage is important. And you certainly see that element in his stories. But like I said, I don't think the purpose of his name dumps is anything like the same kind of thing that you get with the genealogies in the Bible. So like I said, I don't want to overplay that, but to the reader, it comes across in kind of a similar way. You know, reading a genealogy in Genesis, you're like, I'll never meet these people again. Why am I doing this? Whereas in the Silmarillion, you don't know that you're going to meet these people again the first time you read it, but you will eventually. So like I said, the purposes are very different. In Tolkien, you're very much learning about people that you will be reading more about later on, not necessarily so much in Genesis. So there's that. So the tricky thing about the Silmarillion is the fact that the genre is not one genre. I mean, you can't just say the Silmarillion is high fantasy. It is, but there's so many different subparts to the Silmarillion that you can't just say the whole thing just fits neatly into one category. It all fits generally into high fantasy because it's all generally one story, but the first two chapters, or at least the first chapter anyway, the Ainulindale, is basically a cosmogony. It's how the world was created, and in that sense, it's basically like Genesis 1 and 2. It's historical in that sense. It's telling a story of what happened in the past, but that's a very different kind of story than the Beren and Luthien, which is a traditional quest type thing. And then you've got Turin Turambar, which is not even a traditional quest type, but it is, you know, it fits more into a general human type of drama as opposed to a cosmogony or just a history. And so you've got all these different types of stories. So that's part of what makes the Silmarillion difficult, is there is really no one genre you can peg it into. And so if you go into it expecting, I'm going to read this kind of story, you're going to be disappointed, because it isn't just this kind of story. It's a lot of different kinds of stories that all fit together in different ways, but they're not the same in genre. They're not, you know, you're going to get exposition chapters. You're going to get the story of the creation of the dwarves is kind of a narrative, but it's not a traditional narrative that you would think of. It fits more in line with the idea of, you know, this is just setting up for later on down the road, and it gives us some interesting stuff, but it doesn't tell us a typical human drama story either. So, I mean, you get lots of different chapters with lots of different types of genres, just like the Bible has its history books, its wisdom books, it's got different things going on in different places. And so you have to look at it more as a collection, less as a single coherent narrative. And that's the thing. Tolkien was going for all of these things. He was trying to create an overarching mythology for England. And in doing so, he was in some ways also copying, I don't want to say copying, that's really the wrong way to put it, but by force of what he was trying to do, he was doing the same kind of thing as pagan mythologies. And you'll see similar things in pagan mythologies. Like if you read, Homer's Iliad and whatnot, you'll get expositional passages, you'll get, long stretches that aren't really quite the same thing, and then you'll get periods where you'll be focusing on one character like Achilles. And then you get the Odyssey, which is all about Odysseus. And then, other pagan myths, just generally, you get, stories about Zeus, stories about Odin, but none of them end up being one single coherent narrative, because it's trying to kind of encapsulate an entire cultural worldview. And that's what Tolkien was doing. He was creating a world for these languages that he had. And that was really at bottom what he was doing, was working on his languages and trying to create a mythology for England, which he felt was lacking. So at the end of the day, you have to go into the Silmarillion realizing you're not reading a traditional narrative, you're reading something much more like either a Bible or just a collection of pagan myths, because that's much more in the style of what the Silmarillion is than any normal novel. I mean, you can't really think of the Silmarillion as a novel. It's not. I mean, it doesn't fit the description of what a novel is. It just, I mean, you look up the definition of novel, it doesn't. I don't remember offhand the specifics, but it's, by definition, a novel more or less is a traditional narrative where you follow certain people along, you know. I mean, you don't end up with this sprawling narrative that covers huge swaths of time and numerous peoples that aren't all necessarily connected. So that, I think, is really the key that gets up a lot of people tripped up with Silmarillion, is they're going in expecting a novel, and that's not what the Silmarillion is. There's a lot of different genres, and some of the genres are just not traditional fictional genres. So at the end of the day, I think that's the biggest thing that ties together all the elements of why the Silmarillion is hard to read. But if you go into it understanding that, it probably makes it a little bit easier to get through. So hope you enjoyed that video. Hope it kind of give you some idea of why you might have had a hard time with the Silmarillion before. Maybe this will give you the gumption you need to start again. Maybe pick it up, try to go in with a different mindset. If you did enjoy the video, please do give it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do that over at Patreon, which I will put my link in the description below. You can, of course, subscribe to the channel over here. Don't forget to hit that bell icon, because that's a thing. And you can find a couple of my previous videos here. And you can follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.